Under a blaze of chandeliers, a maid crosses the wrong threshold, and the room turns to ice. Laughter cuts like crystal. A duke lifts his hand. The music dies. One scandalous kiss shatters a season and awakens a reckoning no title can silence. In the breath that follows, rumor sharpens into a blade, a past hunger stirs, and an impossible choice rises. Duty to a world built on marble lies, or desire that dares to mend what power has torn. A secret waits at the edge of every whisper. A life will be remade, stitch by stitch. Tell me where you're listening from, and what do you love most about period romances? The slow burn longing, the grand settings, or the courage to defy fate? York, England, the year of 1854. The city glowed beneath the weight of industry and frost. Smoke curled from the chimneys of the factories, drifting toward the cathedral towers, while the bells tolled softly over cobblestone streets, slick with evening rain. In the grand houses of the city's wealthy, candles burned brighter than the stars, and the air was perfumed with the scent of wax, velvet, and pride. In one such house, beneath a ceiling painted with angels she would never be allowed to resemble, Amelia O'Rourke fastened her apron with trembling hands. She was 23, Irish-born and accustomed to silence. The servants' corridor smelled faintly of starch and damp wool, and from the ballroom came the distant pulse of violins. She could hear the rustle of silk, the laughter of women with hands too soft to know work. Her heart beat with the rhythm of the music she was not meant to hear. Mrs. Dorothea Blakeney, the bishop's widowed sister, had ordered her to attend the charity ball as an assistant to the footman, a modest creature among the refined. Amelia's task was to collect discarded gloves and handkerchiefs and to ensure the refreshments were replenished. But beneath the cold command of her mistress there was a deeper cruelty, a hunger for display. Mrs. Blakeney delighted in contrast, the purity of her guests set against the humility of her servants. Amelia adjusted the small wooden brooch pinned to her collar, the one her brother Seamus had carved from oak. Its rough surface was warm against her skin, a secret comfort. It was her reminder that she belonged to someone, even if only to a boy who still smelled of smoke and hope. As she stepped through the servants' entrance into the glittering expanse of the ballroom, she felt as though she had entered another world. The chandeliers blazed with 1,000 flames, their crystals shimmering like frozen rain. The women glided in gowns of violet and blue, their laughter floating like perfume. The men, tall and grave in their dark coats, bowed and smiled with studied grace. Amelia's grey wool dress absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. She became the shadow at the edge of every mirror. From the dais near the orchestra stood Tristan Hawkhurst, Duke of Wycliffe, a man still wrapped in mourning black, though his expression betrayed a restless defiance against grief. His hair, dark as ink with threads of silver at the temples, caught the lamplight each time he inclined his head. Amelia had seen him once before in the cathedral, speaking with a vicar about the mill children. His voice had been low and resonant, a sound that lingered like the toll of a bell. She had never imagined that voice might one day speak her name, or that it would come to silence an entire room. The evening unfolded with the precision of a clockwork waltz. Servants moved unnoticed, trays gleaming, footsteps muffled by the hum of music. Amelia did her work with care, her movements small and efficient, but among the servants jealousy lingered like smoke. One of the maids, Clara Finch, whose vanity had been bruised by Mrs. Blakeney's earlier scolding, sought revenge in the only way she could, by turning cruelty into spectacle. As the orchestra swelled, Clara grasped Amelia's wrist and whispered, "Go on then, show them how the Irish curtsy." Before Amelia could pull away, Clara gave a sharp tug, thrusting her forward. Amelia stumbled into the circle of dancers. The music faltered, a ripple of confusion crossing the room. For an instant, silence hovered. Then came the laughter, bright, cruel, and endless. The kind of laughter that strips the skin from dignity. She froze beneath the weight of 100 eyes, her breath caught in her throat, her face burned, and her fingers tightened over her apron. She wanted to vanish into the marble floor, to dissolve into the pattern of the tiles. The chandeliers blurred through the sheen of tears. At the edge of the room, Tristan Hawkhurst watched, his hand, resting on the back of a chair, stilled. His grey-blue eyes darkened with something sharp, anger, pity, and perhaps recognition. The violins quivered uncertainly. Then he lifted his gloved hand, a silent command. The orchestra fell quiet. The sudden stillness was complete. The laughter died, unfinished. Amelia stood alone in the vast golden room, every heartbeat echoing against the gilded ceiling. Tristan descended from the dais with measured steps. Each stride cut through the space between privilege and humiliation. The crowd parted for him as though pushed by the weight of his will. He stopped before Amelia, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of leather and rain on his coat. "Enough," he said, his voice low but carrying across the silence. Her lips parted, though no sound came. She wanted to apologize. To the guests, to him, to the world that had made her ashamed of simply standing upright. But before she could speak, his gloved hand reached for hers. The touch was warm through the fabric. His gaze met hers, steady, unflinching, unreadable. Then, without hesitation, Tristan Hawkhurst, Duke of Wycliffe, bowed his head and kissed her. It was not a lover's kiss, nor a token of passion. It was something stranger, fiercer, a declaration of defiance. Gasps rippled through the crowd like the intake of a single breath. Somewhere in the distance, a woman dropped her fan. It clattered softly against the marble. When he straightened, he did not release her hand. He simply said, "You are dismissed, Miss O'Rourke." But his tone was not dismissal, it was protection. His eyes lingered on her face, on the trembling defiance that had taken root there. Amelia, trembling, curtsied and backed away, clutching the edge of her apron to steady her shaking hands. The brooch on her collar caught the light and gleamed like a spark against the sea of silks and jewels. As she fled toward the servants' corridor, the murmur behind her rose into a storm of whispers. The music resumed, but the waltz felt thinner, uncertain, as though even the violins could sense that something irreparable had shifted in the air. In the candle-lit hush of the corridor, Amelia leaned against the wall, her breath unsteady, her cheeks wet. She touched the brooch, still pinned where his eyes had lingered, and felt its rough edges press against her skin. A small reminder of who she was, and who she could never be. Inside the ballroom, Tristan stood alone beneath the chandeliers, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, ignoring the scandalized murmur of his peers. The laughter had ended, but its echo would linger. And so would the memory of that single, impossible kiss, the one that had silenced a room and, without his knowing, begun to awaken two hearts divided by the cruel precision of class and fate. At dawn, York stirred beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver. Rain tapped softly on the windows of mill houses and merchants' parlors alike, as if the heavens themselves wished to tread lightly after the night's indecency. But within the parlors of the privileged and the cramped kitchens of the curious, the storm had already broken, not of water but of words. By breakfast, the scandal had a name, and that name was Amelia O'Rourke. The broadsheets spared no detail. A maid kissed by a duke. Who seduced whom? The scourge of the ballroom, a servant's ascension or a nobleman's fall. Even those too dignified to speak of it aloud found their eyes drawn to the columns, the ink still fresh, the implications scandalous and delicious in equal measure. In the parlour of Bishop Blakeney's residence, Mrs. Dorothea Blakeney sat stiff-backed, her lips pressed into a line as she read the articles one by one, her hands encased in lavender gloves that trembled slightly with rage. The lace curtains behind her swayed gently in the morning draught, the fire in the grate unlit. No warmth could soften the chill that had settled over her. "She will be dismissed before the hour ends," she said coldly, turning to the housekeeper. Pack her things. She is not to set foot on this property again." The housekeeper, though hardened by years of service, hesitated. "But ma'am, the girl's nowhere to be found. She hasn't returned from the ball." Mrs. Blakeney's eyes narrowed, pale blue and pitiless. "Then send someone to the servants' hall and inform them her employment is terminated. Leave her belongings by the back gate. I will not have scandal under my roof. Not when I have spent decades keeping it out." Moments later, Amelia returned, her dress still damp from the night air, her hair slightly loosened from its braid, her cheeks pale, her step uncertain but composed. She had not slept. There had been no sleep after that moment beneath the chandeliers, when the world had turned its gaze upon her and judged her unworthy of the air she breathed. She entered through the side door, as all servants did, and was met by silence. Eyes dropped. No one greeted her. On the stone bench near the coal shed, a small cloth bundle sat waiting, her possessions folded, bound, and beside them a coin purse. There was no note. There didn't need to be one. She stood there, staring at it, the morning chill seeping through the thin soles of her shoes, the wind tugging gently at her apron. Her hands trembled not from cold, but from shame. She reached into the bundle, searching for the carved wooden brooch her brother had given her, but it was not there. Gone. Lost in the storm of stares and whispers and violins. Behind her the door closed firmly. She did not turn back. Amelia walked, past the narrow alleys behind the cathedral, past the shuttered bakery that would open in an hour, releasing warmth and the scent of flour and sugar, past the poorhouse, where children waited for bowls of gruel they'd choke down without complaint. And finally, past the mill, tall and grim against the soft light of morning, where her brother Seamus laboured among spools and gears far too heavy for a boy of 13. She paused just for a moment to look at the factory gates. A man stood across the street, smoking. He was well dressed, but his gaze was too sharp for a gentleman, his interest too precise. He stared not at the building but at the entrance, watching, waiting. She moved on. By midday her feet were blistered, her bundle soaked with drizzle, and her throat raw from holding back the sobs that threatened to rise like floodwaters. But she did not weep. Not yet. As she turned a corner off Tanner's Row, a familiar sign caught her eye. Kenley and Daughters, seamstresses and menders of fine apparel. She hesitated. Years ago, before she entered service, her mother had brought torn sleeves and worn hems to that shop. The woman who owned it had warm eyes and hands that worked like they had stitched the world back together once already. Amelia knocked once, softly. It was Mrs. Maud Kenley who opened the door, her sleeves rolled up, a thimble still on her finger. The smell of tea and damp wool drifted out into the street. The older woman took one look at Amelia's face and opened the door wider. "Come in, child, and don't you dare say you're a burden." Inside, the shop was warm and cluttered with colour. Spools of thread gleamed in the morning light. Mannequins stood draped in fabric like silent sentinels. Amelia sat on a stool beside the fireplace, and for the first time since the ball, she allowed her hands to shake. Mrs. Kenley brewed tea, added a splash of milk, and handed her the cup. "Did he hurt you?" she asked, voice low and steady. Amelia shook her head. "No, he saved me. In front of all of them." Mrs. Kenley raised a brow. "Then why do you look like someone buried your name?" Amelia didn't know how to answer, because no one had saved her from what came after. Because no kiss, no matter how noble, could protect a girl without a name or title from the weight of shame. Across the city, in a chamber lined with wood panelling and the hushed conspiracies of men, the Duke of Wycliffe stood before a small group of political allies, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture impassive. "The matter requires clarification," Lord Paxton said, his voice clipped. "Was it a lapse in judgment, or something more deliberate?" Tristan met his gaze without flinching. "Neither." The silence that followed was louder than any accusation. "You are recently widowed," another man offered more gently. "Grief clouds the mind." Tristan said nothing. "You understand?" Paxton continued, that the vote for your child Labour bill will be held hostage if you refuse to make a public statement disavowing the girl. Still, Tristan remained silent. In that silence, power shifted, not in his favour. That evening, Seamus left the mill just as the lamps were being lit. His back ached from lifting crates, his fingers numb from the cold. As he walked down the alley toward home, he noticed a man leaning against a wall, watching. The same man Amelia had passed that morning. Seamus quickened his step, but the man did not follow. Not yet, but the air around him crackled with threat. When he entered the room he shared with two other boys in a narrow boarding house, he pulled off his cap and froze. Sitting on his cot was a brown paper parcel tied with twine. Inside was the wooden brooch. He picked it up slowly, turning it over in his palm. There was no note, no explanation, no signature. But Seamus knew what it meant. Someone wanted them to know they were being watched. Back in the dressmaker's shop, Amelia sewed quietly in the corner, a borrowed needle in hand, the hum of the city muffled by fabric and steam. She wore a new apron now, clean but plain, her sleeves rolled up, her hair twisted tightly away from her face. Her shoulders ached, but her posture was proud. She did not yet know that her name was still on the tongues of York's finest, that mothers would whisper her story into their daughters' ears as a caution or a fantasy, that her shame had become a mirror for the desires and fears of an entire city. But she knew this: she was not a ghost. She had survived, and though she did not yet dare to hope, she had begun to breathe again. In the quiet that lingered after disgrace, Amelia O'Rourke found herself surrounded not by chandeliers or violins, but by thread. Cotton, linen, silk, tangles and spools of every hue and texture lay in baskets and along open shelves, like coiled stories waiting to be told. The shop was modest, warmed by the fire in the hearth and by the women who worked within it. It smelled of tea, lavender sachets and ironed cloth, and it creaked with memory like the bones of an old friend. Maud Kenley's seamstress shop stood at the corner of Bishopgate Street, nestled between a cobbler's and a bookseller's. The windows, clouded by the chill, held no illusions of grandeur. There were no embroidered signs or gilt letters, only the quiet reliability of a door that always opened and a bell that always chimed. It was here that Amelia began again, not with declarations or defiance, but with a needle and thread. She started with mending. Torn hems, loosened seams, sleeves frayed from years of wear. Her fingers, though trembling on the first day, soon remembered the rhythm of stitch and pull. There was comfort in the repetition, in the small triumphs of closing what had once been torn. Maud, with her calm voice and observant eyes, said little at first, but offered her trust not in words, but in action, clearing a small corner table for her, pressing a spool of navy thread into her hand, and calling her daughter once under her breath when she thought Amelia couldn't hear. Other women came and went through the shop, a laundress with raw knuckles, a baker's wife with eyes rimmed in red, a governess with the haunted look of someone who knew too much and had been believed too little. They noticed Amelia, of course. How could they not? But most said nothing. Some nodded kindly. One woman, elegant in a fur-trimmed coat, paused at the threshold, narrowed her eyes, and turned on her heel without speaking. Later, Maud told her the woman was the wife of a local magistrate, known for her charity and her cruelty in equal measure. She's the sort who throws coins at orphans, then scolds them for catching them too fast, Maud muttered as she picked up her shears. Don't take it to heart. Amelia didn't, not fully, but that night as she folded freshly pressed muslin, her fingers stilled. The memory of the ballroom returned. Not just the kiss, but the laughter, the shame, the heat in her face as eyes devoured her like spectacle. She pressed her palm to her chest and, in that quiet corner of the shop, allowed herself a breath that trembled. On the fifth day, the doorbell chimed, and Maud called over her shoulder, "If it's another widow wanting mourning lace, remind her we're fresh out of patience." But it was not a widow. It was Tristan Hawkhurst. He stood in the doorway, taller than she remembered, though perhaps that was the distance speaking. His coat was dark, his boots dulled by the slush of the streets, his gloves removed and held neatly in one hand. He did not wear mourning. Not entirely. His waistcoat was hunter green, subtle but deliberate. His eyes, grey-blue and clear as northern frost, found Amelia at once. "Your Grace," Maud said, adjusting the pins in her bodice with practiced ease. "We don't usually cater to Parliament." "I'm not here for a speech," he said, his voice quiet and measured. "I've been told your shop provides fine winter wear for charitable distribution. I'd like to place an order. Coats for boys, thick wool, lined." Maud raised an eyebrow. "How many?" 100. Amelia looked up from her work. Tristan's gaze met hers, and something passed between them. Not apology, not pride, something quieter. A shared awareness that the world would not let them speak freely, not yet, and perhaps not ever. She rose slowly, brushing her hands down the front of her apron. "We'd need measurements," she said, her voice steady. "And material. We can cut a few patterns in advance, but I'll have the wool delivered by Monday," he replied. They stood there, both too still for the space between them. The room was quiet. Only the ticking of Maud's mantel clock reminded them that time had not stopped. "I'll see myself out," he said, and turned to go. Amelia's voice came softly. "Your Grace." He paused. She took a step forward, her hands clasped at her waist. "The coat you wore that night, was it wool or velvet?" He turned back to her slowly. "Wool," he answered, though I remember the warmth came from elsewhere. The door closed behind him, with a softness that belied the silence he left in his wake. Maud cleared her throat and returned to her pressing. "Well," she murmured, "that was less disastrous than expected." Amelia did not answer. She returned to her seat, but her needle faltered. Her fingers trembled just for a moment, and her heart beat a little too loudly in her ears. That evening, as they finished closing the shop, Maud poured 2 cups of tea and sat across from Amelia near the fire. The windows glowed faintly with the light of gas lamps outside, casting golden halos across the floorboards. "You don't have to tell me," Maud said, stirring her tea, "but I've seen that look before. A man haunted by what he cannot say, and a girl afraid to let herself want what she has no right to reach." Amelia looked down into her cup. "He's a duke, I'm a seamstress. He's a man, you're a woman, the rest is window dressing." They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Amelia spoke, her voice low. "We came here after my mother died. My father couldn't find work. Seamus was still a baby. Liverpool was cruel and hunger. It teaches you things. How to lie, how to steal, how to survive. We buried them in the same week. Fever took them both. I found work scrubbing steps, then stitching, then as a maid." She looked into the flames, her eyes shining but unbroken. "I never thought I'd have a future," she whispered. "Just a way through." Maud reached over and touched her hand, the gesture firm and motherly. "You do have a future. Whether it includes that man or not is your choice, not his." The fire crackled between them, warm and alive. Outside, York remained unaware. But inside the little shop on Bishopgate Street, something fragile was being sewn together. A new life stitched from ruin. A soul mended slowly, thread by thread. And though Amelia said nothing more that night, she rose the next morning with her chin a little higher, her spine a little straighter, because now she knew, whatever her place had been, she had found sanctuary, not only in the shop or the thread, but in her own hands. In her silence that no longer meant shame, and in the memory of a gaze that had seen her not as a servant or a scandal, but as a woman, no longer invisible. The winter deepened over York like a tightening fist. The river lay grey beneath its crust of frost, and the chimneys poured smoke so thick that even the cathedral spires seemed to vanish behind it. In the narrow streets near the mills, the air carried the scent of iron and sweat and the muffled cries of the weary. It was a season that measured people by endurance, and those who lacked it were ground down as surely as the gears of the looms. At dawn, Seamus O'Rourke stood outside the mill gate, cap pulled low against the biting wind. He was smaller than most of the boys, but quicker, with eyes that never stopped watching. When the whistle blew, he joined the tide of children pressing through the doors, their breath rising like ghostly steam. The noise inside struck like thunder, the grinding of machines, the shriek of belts, the clatter of metal teeth devouring cotton. The overseer, Mr. Firth, barked orders, his voice slicing through the din. Seamus kept his head down, working the spools with practiced precision. His fingers were quick, but the ache in them never faded. When the bell rang for break, he slipped behind the staircase to eat a crust of bread. It was then that he heard the low murmur of voices, two men in the counting room beyond the cracked door. "If the inspector sees those figures, we'll be fined," one said. "He won't," the other replied. "Mr. Hemsley ordered me to change the records. Say the accidents were caused by carelessness, not the machines. He'll see the paper signed by week's end." Seamus's heart thudded in his chest. He peered through the gap and saw one man dipping his pen, crossing out entire lines in the ledger. The air smelled of ink and deceit. He backed away quietly, careful not to let the floorboards creak. But he wasn't careful enough. A shadow fell across him, broad and dark. Edgar Hemsley stood at the top of the stairs, his heavy frame outlined by the glow of the lamps. His face was florid from the warmth of the office and the whiskey in his breath. "What are you doing there, boy?" Seamus froze. "Nothing, sir. Just getting back to work." Hemsley descended the steps slowly, each one deliberate. "You've got sharp eyes for a boy. Sharp eyes can be dangerous." Seamus swallowed hard. "I don't mean trouble." Hemsley crouched, the smile that curved his mouth without kindness. "Good, because boys who open their mouths tend to lose fingers, or worse." He tapped Seamus's hand lightly with his cane, as though testing its worth. "Keep to your work, and you'll keep your hands." Seamus nodded, his throat dry. When Hemsley turned away, the boy slipped into the shadows again, heart pounding. That night, when the mill closed, he hid behind the last of the departing workers and carried a small folded page beneath his vest, the portion of the falsified record he had torn from the ledger when no one was looking. By the time he reached Bishopgate Street, his fingers were numb and his breath came in sharp clouds. He entered Mrs. Kenley's shop quietly and slipped the paper into an old knitting bag near the hearth. Amelia bent over a sleeve, glanced up and smiled faintly, unaware of what her brother had carried into their fragile peace. In the days that followed, the city hummed with talk of other things. Politics, scandal, and a rumour that the Duke of Wycliffe had at last been trapped by his own heart. At the Wycliffe estate, the drawing room smelled of old leather and coal smoke. Tristan sat behind his desk while his advisers hovered, their voices a chorus of persuasion and veiled threat. "My lord," said Sir Reginald Caversham, a man with cold eyes and a precise moustache, "this contract binds you to an honourable match. Viscount Morley's daughter is young, pure, and exceedingly wealthy. A union would secure your position and silence this tiresome gossip about the maid." Tristan looked at the document before him. The ink was fresh, the signature of the Viscount already in place. His own name had been forged in an imitation of his hand so exact that only he would have noticed the tremor of difference. He leaned back, expression unreadable. "You forged this?" Caversham's mouth tightened. "It was necessary to protect you and to prevent the ruin of your bill. The public will believe what it must as long as you confirm it." Tristan rose, his chair scraping softly against the floor. "I will not lie." "Then you will lose everything," Caversham snapped. "You forget what the world whispers about you. A widower who kissed a servant at a royal ball. You can bury your dignity or bury your influence, but you cannot keep both." Tristan's eyes, grey-blue as winter skies, flickered with restrained fury. "If influence demands I betray the truth, then I shall do without it." He turned toward the window. Outside, the snow had begun to fall, dusting the dark hedgerows like pale ash. For the first time in years, he felt the faint tremor of defiance, not against others, but against the walls that had held him since his wife's death. Across the city, in the warmth of Maud Kenley's shop, Amelia worked by lamplight. Her needle moved through the fabric with delicate precision, her mind turning not to stitches, but to questions that had begun to trouble her since Seamus returned home pale and quiet 3 nights before. The millboys who came to the shop for mending always spoke in half sentences, how a machine caught a sleeve, how a foreman looked the other way. Once, she noticed a boy's hand shaking as he held a cup of tea. When she asked if he was ill, he said softly, "No, miss, just lucky it weren't worse." That night, as Maud closed the shutters, Amelia spoke. "The mills, do you think they're safe?" Maud looked up sharply. "Safe? No, child, but they're necessary. The city runs on what those walls consume." Amelia hesitated. "Seamus told me something. I think someone's lying about what happens inside." Maud's expression softened with sorrow rather than surprise. Someone always lies. The trick is finding who profits from it. The next morning, Amelia rose early and walked to the factory district. The streets were alive with carts and horses, men shouting, the air thick with coal dust. She stopped outside Hemsley's mill, watching as the children filed in, their faces pinched by cold and fear. She saw her brother glance over his shoulder once, before vanishing into the greyness. A man sweeping the steps looked at her. "Looking for work, miss." She shook her head. "No, just someone." "Then look fast," he muttered. "No one lingers here without reason." Later that day, when she returned to the shop, she found a visitor waiting. Mrs. Dorothea Blakeney, swathed in mourning silk and moral indignation, stood in the centre of the room like a dark monument. "Ah, Mrs." Blakeney said, her voice sharp as the edge of a needle. "There she is, the little temptress of York." Maud stiffened. "Madam, this is a place of business." "I am well aware," Mrs. Blakeney replied, "and I intend to remind this fallen girl that redemption does not come from thimbles and thread. You may fool the weak-minded with quiet eyes and folded hands, Miss O'Rourke, but sin cannot be stitched away." Amelia's face paled, but she did not lower her gaze. She bowed her head slightly and answered, "Perhaps not, ma'am, but kindness can." The older woman flinched as if struck. Her hand, gloved and trembling, clutched her reticule. "You will regret your insolence." "I already do," Amelia said softly. "Every time I remember the woman I once admired." Mrs. Blakeney turned sharply and swept out, her skirts whispering against the wooden floor like disapproval given form. When the door closed, Maud let out a low whistle. "Well," she said, "you've made yourself a proper enemy." Amelia smiled faintly. I think she made herself one first. That evening, the snow thickened. Tristan rode through it toward the orphanage on Grafton Hill, where the first shipment of coats was to be delivered. The world around him was silent, except for the soft crush of hooves and the slow rhythm of his breath. He had not seen Amelia since the day in the shop, but her voice lingered in his mind, the quiet steadiness of it, the courage beneath its calm. When he reached the orphanage, he dismounted and handed the parcel to the matron, who blinked in astonishment. "From the Duke himself?" He nodded. "From those who stitched hope into every seam." Back at Maud's, Amelia sat beside the window, watching the snow fall through the flicker of lamplight. The street was still, the night cold. She reached for her work bag to tuck away her scissors and paused. The old knitting bag near the hearth had shifted just slightly. She opened it and froze. Inside lay a folded sheet of paper, stained with oil and torn along the edge. Across the top, in elegant but unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Safety Records, Hemsley Mill." Her heart began to race. Whatever it was, Seamus had risked his life to bring it here. And though she did not yet know how or why, Amelia understood at once. The truth had found its way into her hands, and it would demand a terrible price. She folded the paper again, tucked it beneath her shawl, and looked toward the dark street outside. The snow fell softly like ashes, and in the hush of that winter night, the whispers of power grew louder, promising that the fight for dignity had only begun. In the heart of Westminster Hall, beneath vaulted ceilings that swallowed light and amplified whispers, the name of the Duke of Wycliffe passed from one tongue to another like a secret too heavy to hold. Though the city of York lay many miles away, its scandal had reached London's corridors of power with the speed of gossip and the precision of a knife. Tristan Hawkhurst stood at the far end of a long oaken chamber, the flickering gaslights casting shadows across the deep hollows beneath his eyes. Dressed in mourning black, with only the faintest glint of a silver watch chain across his waistcoat, he looked less like a man defending his reputation and more like one already condemned. Around him sat the peers of the realm, a semicircle of silver hair, narrowed gazes, and calculated neutrality. "Let the record reflect," Lord Caversham intoned from the centre bench, "that the Duke has been summoned in response to grave concerns surrounding a leaked engagement contract between himself and Lady Honoria Morley, which now appears to be fraudulent in nature. This, coupled with his highly public entanglement with a servant woman, raises significant questions of character, judgment, and political stability." The room was quiet, save for the scratch of quills. Tristan did not speak. "Your Grace," Caversham continued, leaning forward slightly, "do you deny the engagement to Lady Honoria?" Tristan's eyes, grey and stormed with quiet fury, lifted slowly. "I do not recognize the engagement. It was forged." Caversham's lips twitched. "A strong accusation. Have you evidence to support that claim?" Tristan's hands remained folded behind his back. "I do not require evidence to dispute something I never signed." A murmur rippled through the chamber. "And what of the servant girl?" another voice asked. "Lord Whiteley, whose daughter had once curtsied too deeply before Tristan and been ignored. Is it true you kissed her before a royal audience?" Tristan's silence was answer enough. His refusal to deny, to rationalize, to beg, hung in the chamber like incense in a chapel, provocative, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. The inquiry ended without verdict, but the silence he offered echoed louder than any defense. In the hours that followed, as the carriages rolled into the fog and the peers returned to their drawing rooms, speculation fermented in every parlour and club. Had the Duke truly lost his mind to grief, or to some reckless passion for a girl with nothing but thread and freckles to her name? That same evening, in the soft-lit parlour of Maud Kenley's shop, Amelia waited with her shawl drawn close around her shoulders, though the fire was warm. Her thoughts churned like the sewing machines at rest beside her, still but never truly quiet. The city outside was dark, its lamps blurred by the mist that had descended with the late hour. She had not eaten nor slept well in days. When the door opened, she rose without thinking. She knew his footsteps as surely as she knew her own heartbeat. Tristan entered the room like a man walking into judgment. The wind clung to the folds of his coat, his gloves damp from the fog. His eyes, when they found hers, were tired and sharp all at once, like flint waiting for the strike. "You came," she said quietly. "I shouldn't have." "Then why did you?" He removed his gloves with slow deliberation. "Because I couldn't stay away." Her chest ached with the weight of that truth. She gestured toward the chair across from hers. "Sit." He did, but it was not comfort that sat between them. It was all that had not been said. "They questioned you," she said. "They tried. And you said nothing." "I answered only what I deemed worthy of response." "Which means you let them think the worst." He looked at her then, fully, as if peeling back the distance they had both tried to preserve. "What should I have said, Amelia?" he asked, voice low. "That I kissed you to protect you, that the scandal was not your doing, that the engagement was a lie penned by desperate men afraid of losing their grip on a world that no longer bends to them?" "Yes," she said. "You should have said all of it." His jaw tensed. "And what would that have cost? My seat, my bill, my family's name? And what did silence cost me?" Her voice trembled but did not break. "You went back to your world, and I stayed in mine. I was the one they shamed. I was the one they mocked. You gave them your silence and let me carry the noise." The fire crackled. His hand gripped the arm of the chair. "I thought I was protecting you. Then you do not know me at all." They sat there, wounded by one another's truths. He exhaled, long and slow. "I wanted to speak, but I was afraid that if I did, they would take everything from me." "They already have," she said, softer now, "but you don't see it yet." Something in him shifted then. Not anger, not sorrow, but recognition. A dawning awareness that the world he had clung to so fiercely no longer fit the shape of the man he was becoming. Before either could speak again, a door creaked open in the hallway. "Amelia," came Seamus's voice, unsure and hushed. She turned toward him. "Is something wrong?" He entered slowly, his cap in hand, his hair mussed from sleep. "I need to tell you something. About the mill, about what I saw." Tristan stood. "I'll leave." "No," Seamus said, surprising both of them. "You should hear it too." He sat beside his sister, the paper still hidden in the old knitting bag. "There was a man, in the office, changing numbers in the safety records. Mr. Hemsley told someone to do it, said it would keep the inspectors quiet." Amelia's mouth went dry. "You're sure?" "I tore out a page, hid it, and someone's been following me since." She reached for his hand and squeezed it tightly. "Where is it?" He pointed to the corner and she retrieved the paper, burnt at the edge, smudged with oil, but still legible. Tristan took it, eyes scanning quickly. This is enough to open a formal investigation." Seamus's voice shook. "If they find out it was me." "They won't," Amelia said. "I won't let them." He leaned against her, and she wrapped her arms around him, her heart pounding, not with fear, but resolve. Tristan folded the paper carefully. "It has to be handled delicately." "I know," she said, "but we can't stay silent." Later that night, when the shop was still and the streets lay wrapped in mist, Amelia found herself by the fire once more. She did not stitch. She only stared into the flames, feeling the weight of the moment press into her bones. Tristan lingered near the door. Before leaving, he turned once more. "What you said earlier," he murmured. "You were right." She met his gaze. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, until only a breath remained between them. He did not touch her, but his nearness was a promise. "I don't want to be silent anymore." She closed her eyes, letting that truth settle in the spaces where pain had once lived. "Then speak," she whispered. And in that room, dim with firelight and heavy with truths unburdened, something began to mend, not with thread or lace, but with words finally spoken. Words that carried the weight of dignity, the danger of defiance, and the fragile, flickering light of something like love. York held its breath beneath a heavy sky, the clouds the color of slate, and the air sharp with the scent of iron and smoke. Frost slicked the cobblestones and clung to the window panes like lace spun by some merciless hand. It was a city carved in contrast, glass in the drawing rooms, coal in the lungs of its poor. And within that brittle stillness, something broke. It began with absence. At first, Amelia told herself Seamus was merely delayed, a long shift, an extra errand, perhaps a moment of defiance of lingering with a friend to escape the damp chill of the mill walls. But when the lamps were lit and the supper cooled untouched, and still there was no knock at the door, no muddy boots on the mat, no voice calling, "I'm home," the silence turned into something unbearable. Maud tried to soothe her. Boys lose track of time, especially those carrying secrets. But Amelia's hands would not stop shaking. Her eyes scanned every corner of the shop, her breath short, her thoughts twisting like threads knotted too tight. She ran through the alleys, asked the street sweepers, knocked on doors. None had seen him. One girl whispered she thought she had glimpsed him near the old tannery by the river, the one long shuttered, where the air still reeked of lime and rot. Amelia returned with her skirts soaked, her shoes caked in mud, her panic now a living thing in her chest. When the clock struck 8, she did what her pride had sworn never to do again. She went to him. The Wycliffe estate rose in silence above the northern edge of the city, its gates wrapped in frost, its lamps glowing faintly like the eyes of something ancient and watching. Amelia stood at the door, her breath forming quick clouds, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders. Her knuckles met the wood once, twice, then the door opened. Tristan stood there, half-shadowed in the firelight. He said nothing at first, only stepped back and let her in. The warmth of the manor enveloped her like a memory, too familiar, too far. "Where is he?" she asked without preamble, her voice shaking with more than cold. "I don't know," Tristan answered quietly, already reading the terror in her face. "Tell me what's happened." "He didn't come home, Seamus. I've looked everywhere, and someone's been following him. I think it's Hemsley." Tristan's expression darkened. "I need your help," she said. "I know I have no right to ask it, but He stepped forward, the tension in his frame taut as a drawn bow. "You have every right." She faltered then, breath caught in the storm of emotions she had tried for weeks to suppress. The fear, the anger, the longing, each rose like waves crashing against the wall she had so carefully built. "You said you wouldn't stay silent," she whispered. "Then don't." He took her hand gently, led her to the hearth, and knelt before the flames. There, around his finger, still gleamed the band of mourning, a reminder of a life buried, a past still heavy. Her gaze dropped to it. "I can't carry the weight of two ghosts," she said softly. "Not yours, not mine." With trembling fingers, she reached down and slid the ring from his hand. He did not resist. She placed it on the stone beside the fire. The gesture was wordless, but final. Neither spoke. There was only the sound of the logs crackling, the hush of breath held too long. "Where would they take him?" she asked at last, voice steadier. Tristan rose. "Somewhere no one would look. The old tannery, perhaps. Hemsley used it to store unlicensed shipments before he had his new warehouse built." She nodded. "Then that's where we go." Together they stepped into the night. The fog wrapped around the streets like smoke from a dying world. Their footsteps echoed against the stone as they moved through the sleeping city, past the factories still exhaling soot, past doorways where children curled against the cold. Amelia clutched her shawl tighter, not against the weather, but the fear clawing at her ribs. When they reached the tannery, it loomed like a carcass, its walls stained with time, its windows shattered like the eyes of something long dead. The gates creaked open beneath Tristan's hand. Inside, the darkness swallowed everything but their breath. Then, a sound, a shuffle, a low moan. They followed it to a back room where the stink of mold clung to the air. A lantern burned low near the far wall, casting long shadows, and there, tied to a post, eyes wide with terror but body still intact, was Seamus. "Seamus!" Amelia breathed, rushing forward. "Don't!" came a voice from the shadows. A man stepped into the light, broad-shouldered, scarred along the cheek, one hand gripping a pipe. His eyes were cold. "One more step and he gets the iron," he growled. Tristan stepped in front of Amelia. "You touch him, and you'll answer for it." The man sneered. "I answer to Mr. Hemsley, not to you." Tristan didn't hesitate. He moved like lightning, knocking the pipe from the man's hand and slamming him into the wall. The struggle was brief but brutal. The man fought back, striking Tristan across the temple with the lantern. Glass shattered. Flames flickered dangerously close. Amelia screamed. Tristan dropped to one knee, blood running down his brow, but his hand shot out, grabbing the man's collar and hurling him aside. The man fled through the broken doorway and into the night, leaving behind only the echo of his boots. Amelia ran to Seamus, tearing at the ropes. "Are you hurt?" she whispered. Seamus shook his head, eyes wide. "He just scared me. Said if I didn't keep quiet, they'd make it look like I fell into the river." Tristan leaned heavily against the post, his breath ragged. "You're safe now." His voice was hoarse but steady. They walked back through the dark with Seamus between them. Amelia's arm supported Tristan, whose limp had worsened, the blood at his temple crusting slowly. He refused to be carried. Pride, it seemed, was the one thing even blood could not wash away. When they reached Maud's shop, she opened the door with a gasp. Saints above, get in here. Blankets, boiled water, pressure on the wound. The warmth of the fire and the scent of rosemary poultice filled the room. Seamus fell asleep on the cot, curled beneath Amelia's shawl. As Tristan sat in the chair by the hearth, his shirt stained with blood and smoke, Amelia knelt beside him. "You should rest," she said gently. He turned to her, eyes weary, voice rough. "There was a moment, in that room, when I thought I wouldn't get up again." She reached for a cloth, pressed it softly to his brow. "But you did." His hand found hers, held it. "Because you were there." She said nothing, only held his gaze, the space between them electric with everything unspoken. As she stood to leave, her eyes caught a glint of something on the table near Seamus's coat, the brooch, wooden, familiar, burnished smooth from years of touch, the one she'd worn the night of the ball, lost, forgotten, now here. She picked it up, heart hammering. "Where did this come from?" she asked softly. Seamus stirred, eyes half-lidded. "It was in my pocket. The man must have put it there. A warning, or a message." She clutched it tightly. Outside, the fog had begun to lift. The lamps flickered in the street. And in the alleys, the whispers had begun to change. Not shame, not pity. Something quieter, sharper, respect. In the heart of a city built on soot and silence, a story had begun to stir. And it carried the weight of a kiss, the strength of a brother, and the quiet, relentless courage of a woman who had nothing except everything that mattered. The wind that swept across York in early March carried with it more than the scent of thawing earth and coal smoke. It carried a murmured question, passed from baker to midwife, from chimney sweep to tailor's apprentice. Had the girl who was kissed by the Duke truly dared to summon the city to listen? And the answer, whispered with mounting awe, was yes. On the morning the forum was to take place, the city wore a strange hush, as though something sacred were about to unfold. Snow still lined the rooftops, but the sky was a pale, expectant blue, and the streets glistened as if scrubbed in preparation. The Guildhall, ancient and unyielding with its stone arches and timbered beams, had not seen such a gathering in decades. Candles had been lit across the great hall, the benches dusted, the pewter chandeliers polished until the flames danced in their reflections. It had been Maud Kenley's idea to hold the meeting there. Neutral ground, civic ground, the People's Hall. Inside, the audience filled quickly. Mill workers in patched coats sat beside merchants in fur-trimmed capes. Shopkeepers, clergymen, students and maids pressed into the gallery, shoulder to shoulder. No invitation had been sent, no summons signed. And yet by noon the room was full. On the dais, a curate stood nervously beside a lectern. Beside him, Maud Kenley adjusted her spectacles and cast a glance toward the entrance. She needn't have worried. Amelia O'Rourke entered with quiet grace, a soft brown wool dress covering her to the throat, her shawl pinned with the carved wooden brooch now restored to its place. Her hair was pulled back into a low bun, and her hands, though steady, were clenched at her sides. Tristan Hawkhurst arrived a moment later, stepping through the crowd not as a nobleman demanding space, but as a man who had chosen to walk among those he had once only governed from afar. He wore no ribbons, no crests, no entourage, only a deep blue coat and the expression of someone who had learned how to listen. Amelia's eyes met his, and in that instant, something wordless passed between them. Not apology, not even promise, only presence. And that was enough. The forum began. The curate spoke first, thanking those in attendance and acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances. He introduced the issue, the reform bill under debate, the allegations of mistreatment in the mills, and the rumours that had stirred the city into breathless attention. Then he invited the voices who had long gone unheard. A girl stepped forward, no more than 16, with a frayed bonnet and arms that bore the unmistakable trace of old burns. She didn't look at the crowd as she spoke. Her voice shook at first, but she did not stop. "They made us oil the gears without gloves. Said gloves were wasteful. One day my sleeve caught and I burned near to the bone. I was told it was my fault that I was clumsy. I was 13. The hall fell silent. A woman followed, a former worker with grey at her temples. "I asked for my wages," she said. "They said I had taken too many breaks to tend to my coughing, locked me in a supply room overnight. I slept beside crates of dyes and rats. The overseer told me the door had jammed." Gasps echoed from the gallery. Someone murmured, "Shameful." A seamstress from the east side brought a paper folded in 4. "My husband worked the looms. He died last winter. This was in his things." She handed it to the curate, who examined it with wide eyes. Another page from the hush ledger. He held it up, and Maud stepped forward, matching it to the fragment Seamus had recovered. The edges fit, the names matched. The bribes were undeniable. Then it was Amelia's turn. She rose from her place at the front and climbed the steps to the lectern. She did not carry notes. Her voice did not tremble. "I was born to a mother who taught me that silence was survival," she began. "That you bow your head and you do not make waves. That women like us have no right to anger, no space to grieve, no time to dream. We are the background of someone else's life." The crowd listened, unmoving. "But I have learned something since," she continued. "I have learned that silence is not safety, it is a cage, and the moment you speak, truly speak, the bars begin to melt. I stand here not because I want pity or justice for myself. I stand because this city has forgotten how to look at its own reflection. Look at these women. Look at what we carry. Our bodies are the proof, our voices the reckoning. We do not want charity, we want change." The room was still. The kind of stillness that settles when something sacred has been said aloud. And then came the voice that shattered it. "Enough of this." Gasps rose. From the back of the hall, Mrs. Dorothea Blakeney stepped forward, draped in black like a spectre summoned by pride. Her cane tapped sharply against the floor, and her voice cut like glass. "This girl is no martyr. She is a scandal, a disgrace, and I demand that she be removed from this assembly at once." The crowd erupted into murmurs. The bishop, seated near the front, rose unsteadily, clearly discomfited. "Perhaps it would be wise to—" "No." The voice that spoke next was Tristan's. He rose from his seat, slowly but with unmistakable weight. The room turned to him as he stepped beside Amelia on the dais. He did not touch her. He did not need to. He faced the crowd and spoke with quiet, implacable strength. "I was raised to believe that dignity was inherited. That virtue came with a title, but I have seen more courage in this woman than in the entire House of Lords. She has risked her reputation, her safety, her family, for a truth we all pretended not to see. And if you ask me who I choose to stand beside, let there be no doubt." He looked at Amelia then, and the hall held its breath. "I choose her." The applause began slowly. A pair of hands, then a murmur of voices, and then the room thundered. Mrs. Blakeney's face blanched with fury. The bishop sat down in silence. When the clapping faded, the curate returned to the front. "The Guildhall will take a vote. All in favour of recommending full civic support for the reform bill currently under consideration, raise your hand." Nearly every hand rose. The curate looked at Amelia. "Miss O'Rourke, is there anything else you wish to say?" She shook her head, her eyes full but dry. "There is nothing left to say. We've spoken." And for the first time in York's long, merciless memory, a seamstress stood at the centre of its most sacred hall, not as a servant, nor a symbol of disgrace, but as a voice that could no longer be denied. When Amelia descended the steps, Tristan offered his arm. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. They walked side by side, not ahead of the people, not above them, but among them, like glass and coal, finally fused into something unbreakable. The city of York awoke to headlines that no amount of influence could suppress. Industrial magnate flees, amid scandal mill ledgers, reveal decades of abuse. Voices of the Guildhall echo across the north. By mid-morning, the name Edgar Hemsley was no longer whispered. It was printed in ink, thick and black, on every newsstand, pinned to every bakery door and barbershop window. The man who once walked with impunity through the corridors of power vanished overnight. His estate shuttered, his office stripped of correspondence, his carriage spotted on the road to Liverpool before disappearing entirely. What he left behind were accounts to be audited, bribes to be exposed, and workers no longer willing to bow their heads. The reform bill that had once teetered on the brink of oblivion passed its first reading in Parliament by a narrow but undeniable margin. The vote sent shockwaves through the peerage. What had been dismissed as the sentimental ramblings of a grieving widower had, with the testimony of working women and a seamstress's unflinching words, become impossible to ignore. But with triumph came exile. Tristan Hawkhurst, Duke of Wycliffe, received no further invitations to dine at the Viscount of Ashbury's table. His seat at the annual dinner of the Guild of St. Thomas sat empty. His name, once carved in gilt upon the guest lists of England's most refined parlours, was now conspicuously absent. The same lips that had once spoken his name with reverence now curled into knowing smirks at the mere mention of him. And he bore it all with quiet resolve until the arrival of his mother. She came cloaked in black fox and disapproval, descending from her carriage like a Roman empress arriving to oversee the sacking of a ruined city. Her cane was carved ivory, her hat tilted at a precise and unforgiving angle. Lady Imogen Hawkhurst had not travelled north in over 5 years. Her presence now could mean only one thing. Amelia stood in the drawing room of the Wycliffe estate when the footman announced her. She had come, at Tristan's invitation, not for tea or reconciliation, but to speak of the new workrooms being proposed, an idea born from her time in Maud's shop and Tristan's vision for ethical employment. But instead of blueprints, she faced a woman forged in cold steel and social rank. Lady Imogen took one look at her and pursed her lips. "You must be Miss O'Rourke," she said, as if confirming the existence of some ghost. "Do sit. We have much to discuss." Amelia remained standing. "I prefer to listen on my feet." Imogen arched a brow. "How quaint! I won't prolong what is already a tedious scene. I have here," she pulled a folded paper from her reticule, "a settlement drawn by my solicitor. It includes a modest annuity, sufficient for a life of comfort in the countryside. There is a cottage in Derbyshire, recently vacated, with ample space for a brother's studies and no neighbours inclined to gossip. The condition is simple. You leave York and the Duke's company at once." Amelia looked at the document, then at the woman before her. "What is your son's part in this?" Imogen's expression did not shift. "He knows nothing of it. He is a man of sentiment, not strategy. I am merely correcting what he lacks." Amelia stepped closer. "And what do you lack, Lady Hawkhurst? A conscience, or the memory of what it means to be seen and not believed?" The older woman's nostrils flared. "You will take the offer. You are not a duchess. You are not even a lady. You are a scandal wrapped in linen and audacity." Amelia smiled, softly, almost sadly. "And yet here you are, trying to buy my silence. That tells me everything I need to know." Indeed, with slow precision, she tore the paper in half, then in quarters, then let the pieces drift into the hearth where they curled in the flames without ceremony. Imogen stared at the burning fragments. "You'll regret this." "No," Amelia said, voice steady, "but I believe you might." Later that evening she left the Wycliffe estate, not in shame, not in anger, but in certainty. Tristan had offered her space in his world, a place in his plans, perhaps more. But she would not be a secret kept from polite society, or a woman cloaked in a man's title for safety. She had walked through fire. She would not step into shadow. As she passed through the iron gates, she felt the bite of the wind against her face. Her dress, brown wool mended at the sleeve, billowed slightly as she crossed the square. Children ran past her with sticks and shouts. and the scent of roasted chestnuts lingered from a street vendor's stall. The city lived on, indifferent and alive. She did not look back. That week, the national press picked up the story that had begun in whispers and now rolled like thunder. The seamstress who spoke for the North beneath the bold headline appeared a portrait drawn in pencil. Amelia, eyes lifted, mouth set in quiet defiance. The article described the events at the Guildhall, quoted her speech, and praised her refusal to accept the chains of class when the chains of labor had already marked her skin. It called her a voice of conscience in a country that had too long drowned such voices in velvet and coin. When the paper arrived at the Wycliffe estate, Tristan did not open it at once. He stared at the folded edition on his study desk, its crisp corners unmarred, the ink bleeding slightly where the damp of the room met its edge. He sat in silence. The fire crackled beside him, its warmth no comfort. Outside, the sky had turned to pewter. Rain streaked the windows like tears denied. A letter from Parliament rested near the paper, congratulating him on the bill's progress while advising him to tread with caution and consider the social temperature. He opened the paper at last and read. Her words were there, not just quoted but captured. Her voice, her cadence, the way she had stood at the lectern without trembling, the conviction in her spine, the grace that needed no coronet. And then he wept, not for her, not even for himself, but for the space between them, carved by centuries of silence and prejudice, and for the aching knowledge that while she had found her place in the world, he had only begun to lose his. He folded the paper gently this time, laid it against his chest, and whispered her name into the silence. Amelia, not a servant, not a scandal, but the storm and the sky, and the gold that bled through the ink. The letter was written at dawn, not with the bold pen of a statesman, nor the precise hand of a courtier, but in the quiet, deliberate strokes of a man who had spent his life speaking for others, and now found himself desperate to speak plainly for the first time. Tristan Hawkhurst sat at the old oak desk in his study. The edges of the paper curled from the moisture in the air, a faint scent of coal smoke threading through the room. Outside, York was blanketed in snow, soft as cotton, indifferent to politics or pride. He did not address it to Parliament. He did not address it to his mother or to the bishop who had demanded his silence. He addressed it only to her, Amelia. He wrote not as apology, but as recognition of who she was, of what he had failed to see clearly until now. He spoke of the first moment he had noticed her, not the kiss, but the moment before, when she had stood alone on the ballroom floor, her hands trembling but her chin held high. He wrote of the brooch carved by a brother's hand, of silences more eloquent than speeches, and of a life he no longer wished to live, unless it included hers. When he sealed the letter, he did not summon a servant. He tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, buttoned it against his heart, and stepped into the snow. York that morning was hushed beneath its white veil. Chimneys puffed slow columns of smoke, and carriage wheels turned with muffled rhythm on the frost-laced streets. Children built crooked towers from snowbricks. Shopkeepers scraped doorsteps clean with bent backs and red knuckles. But in the shadow of the Guildhall, something new stirred. Inside, warm light filtered through tall, arched windows. The scent of beeswax polish and drying paint mingled with fresh bread from a nearby vendor. The sewing co-op, once only a dream, now stood ready for its first day. Baskets of needles, bolts of donated fabric, workbenches worn from use and time, all arranged with care, pride, and the kind of quiet defiance that builds empires of dignity. Amelia stood near the entrance, speaking with Maud and a woman from the Weavers' Guild. She wore a grey woolen dress, the neckline edged in embroidered violets, stitches she had made by lamplight, alone and unseen. Her hair was pulled back in a braid pinned low, a few wisps softening her cheekbones. The brooch, newly polished, gleamed faintly against the fabric. She did not see him at first. It was Maud who stilled, her hand rising to her lips. The murmur in the room faded into silence as one by one the women turned. Tristan stepped forward, snow still clinging to the hem of his coat. His boots left dark footprints on the wooden floor, like ink blotting parchment. His eyes found Amelia's, and held there. He said nothing. Not yet. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out the letter, creased slightly from the journey. He offered it to her with both hands, palms open, like a man surrendering a crown. She took it. The room held its breath. Amelia unfolded the paper and read slowly. Her lips parted once, then pressed into a trembling line. A tear slipped free, not of sorrow, but of something older, deeper, carved by years of restraint and the sudden, staggering weight of being truly seen. When she looked up, he was already kneeling. Before workers and shopkeepers, before seamstresses who had known hunger and the men who had once looked past them, before those who had gossiped and those who had judged and those who had once called her nothing. He knelt. "I do not ask forgiveness," Tristan said, voice steady but roughened by emotion. "Only your trust. And if it is still yours to give, your hand." A beat, then another. Then Maud's breath caught in a sob, delicate and full of years. Amelia stepped forward, the letter still clutched in her hand. She did not speak, she did not need to. She placed her hand on his cheek, and then into his outstretched palm. The room erupted, not with shouts, but with quiet, awe-filled applause. Some clapped softly, others wiped their eyes. Seamus, grinning from ear to ear, emerged from the back carrying a velvet pouch. "Thought you might need these," he said, lifting out 2 rings, a band of polished brass for Amelia and one of dark iron etched with a barely visible pattern of ivy for Tristan. Tristan rose slowly, brushing snowmelt from his knees. He did not let go of Amelia's hand. The wedding took place that very afternoon. A small chapel near the mill opened its doors, its wooden beams creaking as women poured in, many still in their aprons, faces flushed with disbelief and joy. The children came first, coats freshly brushed, shoes scrubbed clean. Their mothers followed, arms linked, bonnets straightened with trembling fingers. A violinist played from the front row, bow moving slow and reverent. The curate wore patched robes and a tired smile, and still it was perfect. Amelia entered last. Her gown was unlike any ever worn beneath that steeple. It was made from silk remnants, the very scraps she once salvaged from ball gowns that had never belonged to her. Soft cream beside gold, a whisper of lavender near her hem, forest green stitched at her wrist. The bodice hugged her frame modestly, but with undeniable grace. She had sewn it herself, each stitch a refusal to be discarded, a vow that nothing was too ruined to be made beautiful again. Tristan waited at the altar, his green waistcoat, the first since his mourning, catching the sunlight that filtered through the stained glass in a halo of emerald. When she reached him, neither spoke. The curate began the rites. There was no orchestra, only wind against the chapel walls and the occasional creak of a pew. But as their hands were joined and vows exchanged, the world seemed to hush for them once more. Seamus beamed from the front row, Maud dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief she herself had stitched decades before. When the curate declared them husband and wife, Tristan did not kiss Amelia with the fire of scandal, but with reverence. A kiss of recognition, of home, of promise kept. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, not the biting flurry of judgment, but soft, slow flakes drifting through the churchyard like a benediction. They walked into the cold hand in hand, a seamstress and a duke, no longer symbols of outrage or novelty, but of something older than titles and truer than silk, of 2 lives sewn back together, not perfectly, but faithfully, one thread at a time. It was early February, and the city of York woke beneath a pale winter sky the colour of pressed linen. Frost clung to the gutters and shimmered along the rooftops, but the air carried the quiet murmur of industry, looms clicking behind windows, carriage wheels crunching over salted stone, and the gentle swell of children's laughter from the square near the Guildhall. Inside the old stone hall, once reserved for merchants and magistrates, a fire crackled behind a wrought-iron grate. Long tables lined the room, cluttered not with ledgers and scrolls, but with pincushions, spools of thread, and bolts of fabric in soft hues. The room had become something else entirely, something never envisioned by its founders. It had become a mending room, not just for garments, but for people. Amelia stood at the head of the room, her sleeves rolled up, a soft chalk mark streaked across her wrist. She wore no corset today, only a woolen working dress with faded stitching at the hem, practical and beautiful in its own quiet way. Her hair was pinned low, a few strands curling at her temple, and the brooch Seamus had carved, now encased for preservation, no longer adorned her collar. It rested instead in a glass box atop a mahogany pedestal beneath her portrait. Not a painted likeness, an embroidered one, stitched by the apprentices themselves, each thread placed with reverence. Her face, captured in thread and time, looked slightly to the left, as if watching the future unfold. At her side stood 3 young girls, no older than 12, following her fingers with wide, attentive eyes as she demonstrated a new stitch, one they would need for mending coats thick enough to weather the northern winds. Across the room, Mrs. Maud Kenley supervised the fitting of a winter cloak on a schoolteacher's daughter. A familiar warmth filled the air, not from the fire alone, but from the measured hum of shared purpose, of survival reshaped into pride. And there, near the loom closest to the window, sat Seamus. His feet swung slightly as he scribbled numbers into a leather-bound notebook, the margins filled with calculations and small diagrams. His tutor, a stern but patient man from the neighbouring parish, leaned over occasionally to correct a figure or murmur a praise. But Seamus no longer flinched when spoken to, nor darted glances over his shoulder in fear. He had found safety. He had found a name in the city, not as the brother of a scandal or the child of famine, but as Seamus O'Rourke, apprentice mathematician and future machinist. Amelia turned her gaze to the windows as the church bells struck midday. Far beyond the co-op, in the hallowed halls of London, the final vote was being called. The Reform Bill, Tristan's bill, had survived months of scrutiny, whispers and revision. It had become more than a personal crusade. It had become the first legislation in Yorkshire to mandate independent safety inspections in textile factories. A law written not with ink alone, but with scars, with testimonies whispered through tears, and with names signed in calloused hands. When the vote was counted, he was there. Tristan stood in the middle of the chamber in his green waistcoat, head held high, his speech calm and unadorned. He did not invoke his title nor his lineage. He invoked the names of girls like Elsie May, who had lost 2 fingers in a machine accident, of women like Clara, who once worked 3 days with a dislocated shoulder for fear of losing her position, of his wife, Amelia, whose silence had once been mistaken for weakness, but had proven stronger than any thunderous speech. When the final tally echoed through the marble hall, a hush fell, and then applause, not from all, but from enough. He returned to York that evening without fanfare. The train was late, the snow light but persistent. He did not ride in a carriage, but walked from the station, boots crunching along the salted cobblestone. His coat was dusted with frost by the time he reached the co-op steps. She opened the door before he knocked. He said nothing. She smiled. He stepped inside, and her fingers found his without hesitation. That week, another change occurred. Mrs. Dorothea Blakeney, once the loudest voice against Amelia, had retreated to a modest estate in the countryside. The bishop, her brother, resigned his seat in the diocesan council soon after. Their names faded from city talk, replaced by new ones. Young women leading their own workshops, widows organizing literacy nights, mothers sewing uniforms for girls headed to school for the first time. The city had begun to shift, one slow stitch at a time. In the co-op's entrance hall, the embroidered portrait of Amelia was unveiled during a quiet ceremony. Girls in clean dresses stood side by side, and the mayor, who had once called the Guildhall Forum a folly, cleared his throat and admitted he had been mistaken. Beside the portrait, in a small glass case lined with blue velvet, rested the brooch. The one Seamus had carved when they were newly arrived from Liverpool, still unsure whether the world would receive them with cruelty or indifference. It had survived storms, betrayal, and silence. And now it rested among symbols not of loss, but of honor. That evening, after the co-op had closed and the last candle extinguished, Amelia and Tristan walked home together. The snow had stopped. The streets were quiet. Gas lamps flickered golden halos into the gathering dusk. They walked not as symbols of scandal or rebellion, but as man and wife, not hurried, not hidden. Their hands were clasped, fingers woven like braided thread, as if to remind the stones beneath them and the wind around them that they were still here, still standing, still mending. York did not stop for them. Carriages still passed, vendors still shouted morning prices, a child cried somewhere in the distance. But for a moment, none of it mattered. They paused at the corner near their modest home. Tristan looked up at the pale sky, where stars began to blink awake. "Do you think it's enough?" he asked softly. Amelia followed his gaze, then turned her eyes to him. "It's a beginning," she whispered, and in the hush that followed, with the softest light glinting off frost-covered stone, they walked on. Two souls stitched not by circumstance, but by choice, by courage, by love unspoken, then spoken at last, and heard. York, 1871. The city had changed, and yet in many ways it had not. Smoke still rose from the chimneys each morning, carriages still rattled over uneven stones, and the cathedral bells rang at the top of each hour with a voice that had outlived kings, revolutions, and quiet rebellions. But beneath that timeless song, something softer had taken root, less visible than marble laws, but more enduring. It began in a modest shop beside the Guildhall, where a golden sign now hung above the door, the O'Rourke Cooperative School of Needle and Reform. Inside, a dozen girls bent over their work under tall windows, laughter and concentration mingling like woven thread. Their fingers were quicker now, better trained, more confident, but the room had not lost its quiet warmth. The floors had been redone, the tables polished, and framed photographs now lined the walls. Images of factory women turned business owners, apprentices turned tutors, children grown tall. At the far end of the room, seated by the hearth, was a woman with streaks of silver in her dark braid, her back straight and her hands still nimble. Her name was known across Yorkshire. She had once been called the Scandal at the Ball, the Seamstress who spoke for the North, the Duke's ruin, the Duke's salvation. Now she was simply Amelia Hawkhurst. 8 winters had passed since the day she married Tristan in a chapel near the mill. In that time they had built a life not of titles, but of service, not of wealth, but of memory. The co-op had expanded, laws had followed. The reform bill that Tristan had once fought to pass became only the first of many. Safety inspections were now mandatory across industrial Yorkshire. Wages for women, though still unequal, had improved. And most notably, no girl under 12 could legally work in a mill. They had fought for that clause together. Amelia, with a mother's resolve. Tristan, with a statesman's fire. Because now they were parents. Their daughter, Eleanor, had just turned 7, spirited, clever, and perpetually barefoot despite the chill. She often raced through the shop with ink-stained fingers and wild curls flying loose. That morning, she had run off to help her uncle deliver wool to the parish school. Her uncle, Seamus, no longer the boy hiding burned papers in knitting bags. At 22, He was now a schoolteacher and part-time accountant for the Guildhall. He still carried a slingshot in his pocket, more for memory than use, and still blushed when praised. But his voice had steadied, and he no longer looked over his shoulder when he walked through the city streets. He was whole. They all were, in their own ways. Maud Kenley still came to the co-op every Tuesday, slower now, her fingers twisted by time, but her eyes sharp as ever. She had refused offers of retirement. "I'll stop stitching," she'd said. "When the Lord himself sows, shut the sky." Mrs. Blakeney had paid her price. After retreating in disgrace, she had spent her remaining years in a village cottage, rarely seen, her sermons long silenced. No obituary marked her passing, only a small note in a parish paper. Dorothea Blakeney, aged 70, passed peacefully. No survivors listed. Amelia had read it aloud, folded the paper, and placed it into the hearth without a word. Some ghosts, even forgiven, belong to ash, but others endure. That afternoon Amelia closed the shop early and made her way home. Snow had just begun to fall, soft and slow, like it had the night Tristan first walked through it to find her. The Hawkhurst home stood on a gentle rise just outside the city centre, a brick house with ivy climbing its walls and a crooked swing in the garden. As she reached the gate, she saw Eleanor perched in the window, waving furiously, cheeks flushed with excitement. Tristan opened the door before she reached the steps. His hair had begun to silver at the temples, and he walked with a slight limp from an old injury acquired years before in the tannery. But his eyes, those eyes, had never dulled. When he looked at her, it was still with wonder, still with hunger, still with the quiet disbelief of a man who had once lived in marble halls and now chose thread and laughter instead. "You're late," he teased gently, offering her a steaming mug of tea. "I stopped to mend a hem," she replied, brushing snow from her shoulders. "You wouldn't believe the state of young Hannah's uniform." "I might," he murmured, leaning down to kiss her temple. "You've never let a thread fray without a fight." Inside, the hearth was lit. Eleanor curled on a rug beside it with a book far beyond her reading level, and Seamus stirring a pot in the kitchen while whistling off-key. It was not a palace, but it was theirs. That evening, as twilight draped the city in silver, Amelia sat in the parlour with Tristan beside her. The brooch Seamus had carved rested above the mantel, beside a framed embroidery of the Guildhall. "I still think you should let the Royal Portrait Society paint you," Tristan murmured. "And I still think needle and thread do just fine," she replied. He laughed softly, then fell quiet. She turned to him. "Do you regret it?" she asked. He looked at her long before answering. "I regret not doing it sooner." They sat together in that silence, the kind that no longer required words, the kind only earned by years of shared storms and quiet triumphs. Outside, snow fell on the co-op rooftop, on the worn stones of Parliament Square, on the chapel near the mill, on the portrait of Amelia stitched in thread. And inside, where hands had once trembled and voices once broke, there was only warmth, only love. And the soft, slow hum of a needle in a distant room, still mending, still stitching, even now. Some stories are sewn with gold, others with silence and struggle. But the ones that stay with us, the ones that shape us, are stitched with courage. Amelia's journey reminds us that no voice is too soft to change the world, and no hand too callous to offer healing. That dignity does not come from titles or riches, but from standing when it would be easier to bow. And that love, the kind that endures seasons and storms, is made not in ballrooms or marble halls, but in the quiet, everyday acts of choosing one another again and again. If this story moved you, if you felt the hush of the Guildhall, the weight of a thread in a trembling hand, or the warmth of a love that blooms against all odds, leave a comment below. Tell us what part touched you most. And if you made it to the end, write the word "stitched" in the comments. That one word tells us you walked every step of this journey and helps this story reach others who need it. If you wish to support the team behind these stories, we would be deeply grateful for a super thanks in any amount that feels right to you. Every contribution helps us continue bringing heartfelt, richly crafted period romances to life. But even if that's not possible, know that just by sharing this video with a friend, a sister, or someone who loves a good story, you're helping more than you know. And if you long for more tales of love, resilience, and redemption, I've left some of our most powerful narrations linked right here in the cards above. Each one is waiting to wrap you in another time, another place, another heart. Thank you for being part of this story.